Good morning, everyone. I'm about to discuss to you our topic for this morning. It's God's plan. What do you think is the purpose of God for creating all these matters, including you? We sometimes refer the plan of God as the decrees of God, but there are several reasons why we have to use the term plan rather than decrees. The first reason is it stresses the unity of God's intention. Included here is the resultant consistency and the coherence of his action. The second one is to emphasizes what God does. Here we will be able to know his will and what human must do. What will happen to us as a consequences of God's will. Number 3 is it emphasizes the intelligent dimension of God's decision, meaning it is not a coincidence nor lacking of obvious principle of organization. God's plan is like an architect's plan. First, he will draw a mentally and then on paper according on an intention and design, and only afterwards execute an actual structure. On the other hand, the decree of God is simply a declaration or pronouncement that he has made in the working out his plan in various stages. For further understand his plan, we also need to unlock these two virtual synonyms words, the predestinate and the foreordain. Predestinate is literally suggesting the destiny of someone or something, but it is best to use the word God's plan to relate it to particular to the eternal condition of moral agents. It is also reserved as a matter of eternal salvation or condemnation. Within this predestination, we will find the word election. What is election? Election is the positive predestination, meaning that God chooses an individuals, nations, or groups to eternal life and fellowship with him. On the other hand, reprobation is the negative predestination, or God's choice of some to suffer eternal damnation or lostness. Foreordain is God's decision which respect to any matters with the realm of cosmic history. These have a broader meaning than predestination, but according to B.B. Warfield, these two terms are exactly synonymous. Let us look at the biblical teaching. What are some references in the Old and New Testament about this plan of God? An Old Testament presentation, God's planning and ordaining work is a very much tied up with the covenant that the Lord made with his people. As we read about all that God did in choosing and taking personal care of the people, there are two truths about him that stands out. The first one is that God is supremely powerful, the creator and the sustainer of all. God is a loving, caring, personal structure to all. What is happening, was planned long time ago. Like, for example, the destruction of the wicked by the king of Assyria, found in Isaiah 37, verse 26. The psalmist once write in Psalm 139, verse 16, and it shows there that God's plan for us has been written long time ago. God's plan for the welfare of the nation of Israel and all of his children in Psalms 27 verse 10 to 11 and 37. There are also God's will assured bring to actual occurrences in Isaiah 46 verse 10 to 11. And of course, nothing can deter or frustrate the accomplishment of his purpose, found in Proverbs 19 verse 21. In the New Testament, Jesus affirmed that God has planned in many events, such as the destruction of Jerusalem. In Luke, verse 21, 20 to 22, the apostasy betrayal of Jesus and the faithfulness of the remaining disciples. In Matthew 26, verse 24. The fulfillment of God's plan in the Old Testament prophecy is prominent theme in the writing of Matthew. The prophecies fulfilled by Jesus and Psalm 69 verse 21. That is the story when Jesus was thirsty, and they give them the wine vinegar. And that was fulfilled in John 19, verse 28. Concerning about the future events, like for example, the rumors about the wars, such thing will happen before the end will come. And the apostles emphasizing the divine purpose and the efficacy of the divine plan in Revelation. We will now about to discuss the general characteristics of God's plan. Number one is God's plan is from all eternity. Two, God's plan and the decision contained therein are free in God's part. The purpose of God's plan in His glory. God's plan is all-inclusive. God's plan is efficacious. Number six, God's plan relates to His actions rather than His nature, His decisions regarding that He shall do, and not His personal attributes. God's plan relates primarily to what God Himself does in terms of creating, preserving, directing, and redeeming. God's plan relates primarily to what He does. The action of humans are also included. And the last, God's plan is unchangeable in terms of its specifies. Let's ask the question, God's plan or human action? We have two beliefs in this time. We have the Calvinist belief and the Arminian belief. According to the Calvinist belief, God's plan is logically prior, and that human decisions and actions are consequence. With respect to the particular matter of the acceptance or rejection of salvation, God in His plan has chosen that some shall believe and thus receive the offer of eternal life. While the Arminian belief, according to them, they place a stronger emphasis on human freedom, and that God allows and expects humans to exercise the will they have been given. And if there was not so, we would not find the biblical implications to choose that God, whosoever will passage such as, come to me and all you are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. The very offering of such invitations implies that the hearer has the genuine possibility of either accepting or rejecting them. For the moderate Calvinistic model, God's plan is unconditional rather than conditional on human choices. What does it mean? It is simply having a knowledge of what is to come. The foreknowledge is linked in the will of God in Acts 2 chapter 2 verse 23. His unconditional nature is made explicit, meaning it's clear. For example, when God chooses Jacob over Esau, God told Rebekah that the older will serve the younger. Next one is that God has created genuinely for free being and yet renders certain all things that are come to pass. It is rendering something certain and rendering it necessary. It is a matter of God's decision that something will happen and a matter of His decreeing that is must happen. So what is freedom? Freedom means that you are not under constraint. When you say constraint, no one is forcing you. According to Gottfield and von Ness argument, God knows all the intimate or infinite possibilities. For John Fenberg ideas, God's plan should be referred to as His decree rather than His decrees. And according to B.B. Warfield's position, God does not begin by rendering those who has chosen transforming for their souls, so that they believe that rather He works in an appealing, persuading passion, so that they are freely choose to believe, and that they regenerates them. God's will and God's wish. When we say God's will, it is a general intention of God, the values with which is pleased. While God's will, it is God's specific intention in giving a given situation. What He decides will actually occur. There are various understandings of the history. we have here, to understand more of the history, we have the clinical views. What does it mean? Clinical views does not see the history as progressing, but it is simply repeating the same pattern. For example, Hinduism, they are giving an emphasis on reincarnation. So one goes around cycle of death and birth. Number two is doomsday views. Doomsday philosophies, they believe that the history will soon come to do this disastrous end as a result of either economic collapse as an ecological crisis involving massive pollution of the environment or an outbreak of nuclear warfare. The human race is doomed because it has failed to manage the world wisely. Next is the existentialism. This existentialism means that there are lacking in any discernible pattern in the events of the history. One must create one's own meaning by a conscious act of free will. We have uh, the next one, the dialectical materialism. This is based on the philosophy of the communism. Adapting to George Hegel's philosophy, Karl Marx replaced it with idealistic metaphysics, which is materialistic view. So forces of the material reality are impelling history to its end, though a series of steps, the economic order is being changed. So because this trust is in the impersonal force, many people under communism found it neither personally satisfying nor societally effective. And the last one is Christian doctrine of the divine plan. Christian doctrine, which affirms that all-wise, all-powerful, good God has from all eternity planned what is to occur and that history is carrying out his intention. The force behind it is rather a loving God with whom we can have a personal relationship. Thank you for listening and God bless you.